This is week 5 of the college baseball rankings. Let's get into it. And this week, there were upsets all over the top 25, which just coincidentally happens to line up with the first week of conference play for a lot of these leagues. So, starting off, top team, still LSU, I'm guessing. It's going to be the same for you. They're kind of separating themselves as that number one team, similar to what we saw last year with Tennessee, just consistently winning. And their first conference series was against Texas A&M, and they did the job there by winning it.
Yeah, like you mentioned, LSU just starting to pull away with things here. Another series win over Texas A&M. They do lose that Sunday game so that they don't get the sweep and get their second loss of the season, but they just continue to win these series pretty handedly and are really looking like the best team in baseball at this point.
Yeah, definitely. Team right after them that we had last week was Wake Forest, and for me, they stayed in the same spot. They had a pretty solid week. They did their job. The pitching looked pretty good over the weekend, and yeah, they faced Notre Dame, so definitely not the same competition as what you saw with a team like LSU, but they got it done and definitely deserve to stay in that spot for me.
Yeah, Notre Dame not as quality of a team as they were this last season when they made it to Omaha, but still a quality opponent and good series win for Wake Forest, enough to stay in this two spot for the time being.
Yeah, and similarly, number 3, we are pretty high, or were pretty high on Arkansas previously, but they definitely are starting to prove that they kind of deserve that spot with going 5-0 this past week, 18-2 record, same as LSU, but probably just not as high expectations as LSU has, but they did sweep Auburn, which was a team that was just on the outside of the top 25 last week and kind of put them as an afterthought now, but did a great job there.
Yeah, like you mentioned, Arkansas just didn't start as high up in the season, but they're just consistently winning, similar to LSU, and they just keep pegging their way up these rankings as teams in front of them lose. And sweeping a fringe top 25 team like Auburn was certainly impressive.
Yeah, and then after this is when things kind of get a bit complicated with a few SEC teams that were in the 4 and 5 spot, Tennessee and Ole Miss having awful weeks. Tennessee going 1 and 3, getting swept at Missouri, which looking at things now, they kind of still have yet to beat a good team and just an awful start to the SEC. And Missouri just absolutely rocked the starting pitching of Tennessee, which is kind of not what you expect to see with that team.
Yeah, I mean, Tennessee, one of the best pitching staffs in the country. Just a number of Friday night starters on that pitching staff. And like you mentioned, they got rocked this weekend. And Missouri was one of those teams after the first weekend where you're like, you weren't expecting them to be good, but they did well at Globe Life in that tournament. And now they're proving that they may be better than a lot of people were thinking with an impressive series win like this.
Yeah, definitely deserve a shout to being ranked and probably are in most places. And then similarly with Ole Miss, they were in the 5 spot and went 0-4 this past week, facing Jacksonville State in midweek, losing there, and then getting swept at Vandy, who we did have at number 7. But speaking of them, I did have Vanderbilt jump up into that 4 spot, hopping over Louisville, even though Louisville will be going up. I just thought Vandy has just put together a really good season so far. Even though they have looked iffy from time to time, they just absolutely dominated Ole Miss, only giving up 4 runs over the weekend.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think it's pretty close between Vanderbilt and Louisville here, but at this point, Vandy just has those quality wins. They have this sweep over Ole Miss and have that series win over UCLA as well. So they have looked shaky at times, but the resume kind of speaks for itself at this point. And I think they're deserving of this 4 spot.
Yeah, they do have 5 losses, which is a lot more than Louisville, who has 2. They're 17-2 right now. But just the quality of opponents that Vanderbilt has played, like over several different weekends, is just one of the best in the nation so far. And Louisville went 3-1 this past week and faced Georgia Tech over the weekend, which was another team that was kind of close to being ranked. If they could pull out a series win over Louisville, they might have been able to get there, but Louisville definitely separating themselves now as like one of the top teams in the ACC, and they haven't had like a bad week yet with that 17-2 record showing that. So for me, they slotted into the 5 spot. But yeah, what are your opinions there?
Yeah, I also have Louisville here in this 5 spot, and through the early part of this year, it's really starting to look like it's going to be Louisville versus Wake Forest for that ACC title. Those look like the clear cut two best teams in that conference at this point. So we'll see how things shake out through the season, but Louisville's definitely been impressive up to this point.
Yeah, I think Virginia could creep into that conversation. Yeah, once they start playing more competitive teams, which they have been doing recently. But definitely for now, those are seem like the top two teams in Wake Forest and Louisville, with Virginia kind of looking a little bit on the outside, but their record kind of speaks for itself as well. But after Louisville, I followed it up with Florida, who had a good weekend, won their midweek, and then faced Alabama, which is another team that was just outside the top 25, just dropped out last week from our top 25. So they won the series there, and yeah, went 3-1 over the week. So good weekend. They had close games with Alabama, but won the series, so did their job.
Yeah, and this Florida team has looked extremely talented all across the board up to this point. One of the more impressive teams just when you watch them. And so definitely impressive, and I had them in the same spot here.
Then in the 7 spot, I think is when you can kind of start thinking about the previous SEC teams that did fall down a bit. But for me personally, I had Stanford rise up a few spots after they went 3-0 over the week and swept Oregon State, who was just on the inside of being ranked at the number 24 spot. This past week, obviously, that's going to be a lot different with them getting swept by Stanford. But yeah, good weekend against Oregon State. Games were competitive, but they still got the sweep, and that's all that matters in the end.
Yeah, good bounce back week from Stanford after dropping that series at USC, which was surprising to most people. But winning a series over Oregon State, especially with the sweep, is impressive. Even if it may be a bit of a down year for Oregon State, still a notable program, and they are talented. So good series win, and I also had them here in this 7 spot.
And then at 8 is kind of when I started thinking about the Tennessee and Ole Miss grouping and how far they kind of deserve to drop, with teams like Virginia and UCLA kind of in that area as well. I personally had Tennessee 8, Ole Miss 9, and then Virginia, UCLA right after. But I think you can kind of make a case for any of these teams being in a certain order, especially after the bad weeks that Tennessee and Ole Miss faced, with Virginia and UCLA starting to put together pretty good resumes, with Virginia finally starting to play against good teams and showing that they deserve to be in the top 10, and then UCLA just consistently going week in, week out, and being a very, very solid club. And this week, sweeping Arizona, and just back to back weeks of Pac 12 series wins. And they're just looking like definitely one of the top teams there.
Yeah, I actually did the little flip flop of what you did there. I had Virginia UCLA in the 8-9, and then followed up by Tennessee Ole Miss at 10-11. Just like you mentioned, Virginia finally gets a quality series win, starting to play better opponents, and then UCLA as well, starting to have one of the better resumes in the country as well. Even with the two of their losses were on the road at Vandy, so they have an impressive resume altogether. I think it's hard to keep them out of the top 10 at this point. And like we mentioned earlier, Tennessee just doesn't really have quality wins up to this point in the season. So we'll see if they can change that this weekend playing Texas A&M. But yeah, they just haven't really impressed at this point, and I think Virginia and UCLA are deserving of being ahead of them right now.
Yeah, I think that's definitely warranted. Just looking at their records and not looking at anything else, you can see there's definitely like a difference. And with the competition, it all seems relatively similar with what they've faced so far. So yeah, I'm good with putting Virginia 8 and then UCLA 9 right after. And then at 12, I had East Carolina. We had them there last week. They went 4-1 won over the week. They had a good week against average competition, so I felt like just leaving them in the same spot was a good place for them to be.
Yep. I also left them here. Just took care of business as they should. Got that sweep over Missouri State. That's about what you expected from them. Good week and enough to stay where they are.
Perfect. And then after that for me was Texas A&M dropping back a few spots from 10 last week after going 2-2, um, going against LSU over the weekend. It's kind of what you expect, them winning the midweek against Houston and then getting one game against LSU. Obviously, they had the opportunity to rise up a lot, but 2-2 is kind of what you expect, so can't really drop them too far back.
Yeah, I did drop Texas A&M a little further. I had them in the 15 spot for me, and
Okay.
I had Texas Tech in the 13 spot after that series win over Oklahoma State. I thought they looked really impressive this weekend, and they do have the record to kind of back it up at this point. And I followed them up with South Carolina in the 14 spot. It's a first team to 20 wins. They hadn't played any tough opponents really up to this weekend. And not that Georgia is in the top echelon of the SEC, but it was impressive for them to sweep Georgia, I think, in their first weekend of a quality opponent.
Yeah, and Georgia was a team that we were like thinking about potentially in the future if they can string a few games together, then could definitely be at the back end of being ranked. So for uh, for South Carolina to take care of business there and get to 20 wins, I think yeah, looking at it from that side of things, I think they do deserve to be over Texas A&M in that spot. So I'm good with putting Texas Tech and South Carolina above them. In the 16 spot, I had UNC jumping up 2 from last week. They went 3-0, facing all different teams throughout the week. They were supposed to have a weekend series at Pitt, but were only able to play one game there. So went 3-0, but you kind of wish that they were able to play more games there and kind of prove it a little bit more. But I mean, they won all their games they played, so for me, just jump up a few spots with a lot of teams around this area losing. So just the opportunity was there for them to rise up.
Yeah, I had them still at, or actually I had them moving up one spot to 17 in mine, and I had Oklahoma State at 16. I didn't think Oklahoma State looked bad this weekend in that series loss to Texas Tech, and I do think they've played one of the higher quality schedules up to this point in the entire country. So still pretty high on that team. Didn't think it was a terrible week for them, but I do think UNC has looked good up to this point, and I could go either way with those two.
Yeah, I had Oklahoma State dropping one spot or two spots further back to 18. I mean, they went 2-2, faced DBU midweek, won that game, and then kind of met expectations, losing the series at Texas Tech, which is road series usually has that advantage going to the home team if they're like around the same caliber of team there, which it seems like they are sitting around the same area in the rankings last week and similarly this week. So, yeah, I can kind of see it whatever order. I had Boston College creeping into the rankings. We decided not to bring them in last week, but I think they deserve to jump up pretty high, and I had them at 17 this week with just what they've been able to prove in back-to-back weeks, and they have really dominated the schedule that they've been given so far, and going 2-1 at Florida State this past week. Just another impressive road series, and all their games have been on the road. So you just have to give them complete props for what they've been able to put together, and definitely deserve to be around this place.
Yeah, I also had them jumping up in this area. I had them at this 18 spot after Oklahoma State and North Carolina. Like you mentioned, been on the road the whole year and are stacking up the quality wins at this point. Bit of a surprise team, but they've looked very good up to this point.
Okay, so I think taking all things into consideration, I think we go UNC, Oklahoma State, then Boston College, if you're good with that.
Yep.
And then in this 19th spot, there are a lot of teams dropping in and out of the rankings around this place. We had TCU in this area last week. I took them all the way out. because they're 10-9 overall. They're facing one of the toughest schedules in the nation, but their record just is not proving that they deserve to be in the top 25 right now. Seems like they have some injuries, which once they get healthy, I think they probably can make it back in there if they can string some things together. But going 1-3 the past week, losing their midweek at Texas State, and then losing at Oklahoma, the series there, it's just another iffy week, and just the losses keep piling up, and you can't really have that. And I had Missouri jumping in and taking their spot, just swapping out after they just crushed the weekend, going 4-0 overall, midweek involved there, and then sweeping at the time number 4 Tennessee. So just amazing week, and definitely deserves to jump into the rankings there after their 16-3 overall as well. It's just they've put together a good season and finally got those quality wins to prove that they deserve to be ranked.
Yeah, I had two more newcomers here following up Boston College. I had Missouri in the 20 spot there. Like you mentioned, super impressive sweep over Tennessee. And like I mentioned earlier, after that opening weekend, they have some quality wins across the board, not just this one weekend. But in the 19 spot, I had another unranked team that also pulled off a sweep, and that is Miami with their sweep over Virginia Tech. I thought that was a very impressive series. And since their series lost to Florida, they've put together back to back quality weekends. And I think they're starting to look like more like that team that we had in the top 25 originally.
Yeah, I had them around that area as well. Just so we can get this out of the way, I had 4 teams drop out of the rankings, which opens up 4 new spots. For me personally, I had Missouri, like I mentioned, Miami, Kentucky jumping in, and also, oh yeah, Boston College. So what other team did you have jumping into the rankings?
Yeah, so outside of Boston College, Miami, and Missouri. There was a couple teams to consider. Kentucky was right on the fringe for me, and the team that I did jump in was Florida Gulf Coast. Put together a couple good weekends in a row now, and I thought the series win over Liberty was pretty quality. And they also have that series win over Florida State, which I think is pretty impressive. So they were my last newcomer to put in the rankings there.
Yeah, it's tough because or at least we had Florida State pretty high up there, so that series win for Florida Gulf Coast looked really impressive a few weeks ago, and now it just kind of keeps looking a little bit worse and worse with Florida State. For me personally, right at the back end of the top 25 and just on the fringe of not being ranked there. So it's just I don't know. With that being their like marquee series, it's they keep putting together decent weeks, but for me personally, just like on the other side of being ranked at this point, with Kentucky being that last team in after their 18-2 overall record, they haven't really played anybody that spectacular, but they did just sweep Mississippi State, which you kind of never really expect. Mississippi State seems like they're going to be in a down year here, but you never know with this team. And look, getting a sweep in the SEC is always something special, and for it to come against a team that usually is pretty good is another positive.
Yeah, I would agree. I also have Florida State at the back end, like you mentioned. For me, the top 25 was rounded out by Florida State at 24 and Virginia Tech at 25. Uh, did you keep Virginia Tech in as well?
Yeah, I have Virginia Tech 23, Florida State 24, and then Kentucky at 25. So similar spots open, but yeah, I think we can fill in the a little bit higher up and then get to those last few spots in a minute. So yeah, for you, you had Miami at that 19 spot. I had Missouri there, and then around that area also is Campbell and UCSB, who we had in the rankings at 21 and 22, respectively, last week. They both had good weeks. Campbell went 3-1. They lost their midweek to Coastal Carolina, and then swept Winthrop. But I mean, it's tough because Coastal was the one good team they faced last week, and they weren't able to get the win. And that's kind of what you want to see out of a mid major that doesn't face amazing competition week in, week out. So, them kind of losing their one good game that they could take advantage of there is just not the best look, but obviously still going 3-1, you can't really dock them for that. And then UCSB 4-0 swept Cal State Bakersfield over the weekend and beat LMU midweek. It was a good week for them. It's just bad competition, so kind of what you expect there, but did their job. And I don't know, I feel like you can leave them where they're at, maybe go up one spot for both of them. It's really just preference at this point.
Yeah, I also had Campbell and UCSB staying in the 21-22 spots that we had them in last week. And so ahead of them, we have Miami and Missouri, I believe.
Yeah.
Could go either way here. I'm fine with giving Missouri the nod. Do they have the overall record advantage if you have them in that 19 spot?
Yeah, that works for me. And just getting that complete marquee sweep is just impressive. We'll see how Tennessee rebounds off that, but yeah, I think they definitely deserve that 19 spot with what they've been able to put together this season so far. And yeah, then 20 we go Miami, then Campbell, then Campbell 21, and then UCSB 22, and then we're stuck with Virginia Tech, Florida State, and then Kentucky or the team that you decide to bring in there with FGCU. But yeah, I think there's definitely merit for both those teams in one of those final spots. Just kind of how you look at things. I mean, Kentucky is 18-2. They haven't really, like I mentioned, played anybody up to this point, but they still are getting the wins at a little bit higher rate than Florida Gulf Coast, who also kind of their one marquee series. Liberty seems like they're down this year a bit, even though they won the series this week against them. Yeah, Florida State is their one series win that seems to be their one differentiating factor. And yeah, Florida State is probably a little bit better than what we're seeing out of or Mississippi State, but I don't think it's that much of a difference at this point. It's tough. These final three spots definitely could put them in any order with those four teams that we have mentioned.
Yeah, I'd almost rather drop Florida State or Virginia Tech.
Make it easy. I don't know. It's just tough because they were pretty high in the rankings previously with Virginia Tech at 14 and Florida State at 16. So if you if you drop one, it feels like you should probably drop both. Their records are very similar, and yeah, they haven't really proven it that well the past few weeks with Virginia Tech's second straight weekend loss against quality opponents, and they just haven't really proved it against any ranked teams yet or anybody close to being ranked. And then Florida State just having terrible weeks one week and then just doing pretty well the next week. Just inconsistencies showing, which definitely aren't what you see out of a standard top 25 team. So if that continues, definitely deserve to be dropped in the future. But I don't know. There isn't really another team outside the top 25 that I can see that kind of warrants dropping both of them for another team to jump in there, because there just isn't another team on the that really proved it this past week, with a lot of these teams right on the outside not having great weekends or just not facing good opponents to really boost them that much into it.
Yeah, I think the thing for me is that if FGCU is right on this fringe here, I would just have them over Florida State in the head to head, just given what's happened up
True.
to this point in this season. And I mean, there's definitely points throughout a season where you kind of forget the head to head matchup. It doesn't matter later on in the season if things change and stuff. But I do think it's pretty relevant at this point right now since they played recently. And I would have Florida Gulf Coast ahead of Florida State personally.
Right.
Um, but I mean, I do think Kentucky is pretty deserving of jumping in the rankings as well. I mean, the only reason Florida State and Virginia Tech are in right now is because of how high they were ranked previously. So,
Right.
I,
So
I,
if we were to take both Virginia Tech and Florida State out, what teams do you think could potentially take that last spot?
so if we have Florida Gulf Coast in,
Yeah, if
and
we have
then
Florida Gulf Coast and Kentucky both in, then there's one spot left.
could bring in a team like GCU or UCF, or my other consideration would be just dropping Florida State and leaving Virginia Tech in,
Yeah, it's
even though
tough.
they're similar situations.
Yeah,
It's like
it's just such a similar situation between those two teams.
regardless, they're in that.
And if you were to bring up head to head, UCF did just beat Florida State 2 games in midweek. So I mean, there definitely is some merit there for UCF to also jump in if you're kind of deciding that same thing for Florida Gulf Coast.
Yeah, I mean, we could go Florida Gulf Coast, uh, Kentucky or UCF, either way in that 24-25, and drop both of them if you want.
Yeah, I mean it's a funny way of how things turned, where Florida State was looking like they could potentially challenge for that best team in Florida, and now they're behind UCF and Florida Gulf Coast. But I'm all for it. We love to see it. We love to see the underdogs come and take the spots. So yeah, we'll just have to figure out the order now.
Big mid-major supporters here.
Oh, you know it. So for 23, we can go FGCU or Kentucky, and then I'd say probably last spot with UCF there, just because they're kind of the team that we had the afterthought about bringing in. But yeah, I think either or Kentucky or Florida Gulf Coast can be 23 or 24 there.
Yeah, either way is fine with me.
Okay, I think maybe just give the nod to Kentucky record wise, 18-2, and
Yep.
finally got a decent series win. So yeah, we can go Kentucky 23, and then the Florida schools 24 and 25.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with these fringe teams is they just consistently got to prove it week to week. So these
Yep.
one spot differences aren't really gonna matter a whole lot. So
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, they're gonna not be facing the toughest competition for the most part, so they just have to keep doing well, and that's the only way they maintain their spot. But it's definitely harder to lose because of that weaker competition that they're facing.
yep.
So the top 25 for week 5 goes as follows: UCF at the 25 spot, Florida Gulf Coast 24, Kentucky 23, UCSB 22, Campbell 21, Miami 20, Missouri 19, Boston College 18, Oklahoma State 17, UNC 16, Texas A&M 15, South Carolina at 14, Texas Tech 13, East Carolina 12, Ole Miss 11, Tennessee 10, UCLA 9, Virginia 8, Stanford 7, Florida 6, Louisville 5, Vanderbilt 4, Arkansas 3, Wake Forest at 2, and LSU still the number 1 spot.